Okay, here's our interview with Antony Davies.
I thought I'd like to cover a little bit of COVID because I think that really plays into a lot of what you're talking about when we talk about cooperation and coercion. And it's a real struggle right now that governments around the world are dealing with, which is whether to use cooperation or coercion to fight the coronavirus that I didn't think I'd still be talking about it right now, but now with the stupid Delta variant and so on, I guess we got to still talk about the
Right.
stupid
Yeah.
coronavirus. But maybe we'll start with you giving just a kind of a brief explanation of the thesis of your book and the concepts of cooperation and coercion, and then let's start talking about it in principle with COVID.
Sure. So we sat down to write cooperation coercion, and what was the motivation for this was realizing that every time humans come together to do anything is when there's more than one of us, we organize either according to principles of cooperation or principles of coercion. Principles of cooperation simply are we come together voluntarily, and if things work out, that's great. And if they don't, you're free to walk away and do something else. Principles of coercion, however, involve somebody or somebodies telling us what we're going to do, and by threat of force, you have to do what these people say. And typically, we think of government as the coercive body and markets as the cooperative body. But there could be other things. Typically, government is the accepted coercive body. On the cooperative side, you can have things, of course, markets, but also other things like your church community is a cooperative venture. Civic organizations are cooperative ventures. Your Friday night poker game is a cooperative venture. So any situation in which you're free to walk away as a cooperative venture. Now, we started out with the intent of showing cooperation is good, coercion is bad. And as we got to the end of the book, it wasn't working. And we realized it wasn't working because that's the wrong story. The right story is these are two tools that we use to address problems. Some problems are better suited to cooperation, other problems are better suited to coercion. And the trick to forming a healthy and vibrant society is using the right tool for the right problem.
Okay, why don't you just hit for us briefly what calls for coercion versus cooperation?
Yeah, and there are all sorts of examples around the edges that we can argue about, but generally speaking, the problems that involve to which coercion is best suited are problems that involve somebody imposing harm on someone else. And the harm can be physical, it could be a company defrauding customers, it could be somebody polluting the environment. These are all instances of one person imposing harm on another. And when you have a situation like that, coercion is generally the correct tool to use.
Mm-hmm. And all of this ultimately, I think, then tells you what's the proper role of government. That's the end of what you're trying to figure out
Right.
here, right? Is
Yeah.
what things are proper for the government to take on and what's proper to leave to the private sector. What about something that kind of seems in the middle, like roads and bridges type of thing? How do you
Yeah,
address
and
that?
that's an interesting thing because roads represent this weird kind of a thing where there's some question if you left it to the private sector whether the things would get built at all. And the problem there is once a road is built, anybody can use it, and if anybody can use it, why should I pay for it? And you have this problem, right? It's called a public good problem. And typically government is better at addressing problems like that than markets. However, as technology changes, it becomes more possible for markets to address problems like that. So you have things like GPS trackers today, which we did not have in the past. And with GPS trackers, you can track where a car is moving. And if the road is private, you can send the person a bill for it. And so as technology progresses, the number of goods that are probably over here in this category of best to use coercion to produce these things, that the number of goods actually starts to decline, and you get more and more goods over here on this side that for which cooperation is the better tool.
And in general, cooperation is, well, I guess this is the theory you went in with, that cooperation is necessarily better than coercion. I mean, that's true for most things, I guess is what you're saying?
It's true for most things. And again, the line in the sand tends to be this thing of preventing people from harming each other. Generally speaking, people don't harm each other. Yeah, some people do, but they tend to be the exception. And so generally speaking, cooperation tends to be the rule more often than not. And we use it so often, we don't even think about it. I mean, our conversation right here is an example of a cooperative venture. We freely came together and we're doing this thing. And so we tend to notice the coercive things because they're so rare.
And so what are some of the things that government is coercing that you believe would be better left to cooperating?
Yeah, there are a couple of big things. Social Security is one of them. So the government comes in and says, okay, by force, we're going to take a portion of your paycheck and we're going to use it to support people who are retired. And we can have a conversation about a social safety net for people who really do need something. But that number of people tend to be very small compared to the size of what Social Security covers. And this is a coercive venture. And one of the problems is that with coercive ventures, you don't get the profit loss feedback that makes cooperation so vibrant. And so we have this situation now where Social Security itself says that in about 15 years, it's going to be insolvent. It is as compared to its voluntary brother, the 401k plan, the IRA. Social Security is not it's not a vibrant, it's not a healthy program like these other private cooperative programs are.
Okay. And what's the other one? Other big one?
Well, another good example is the minimum wage. And we talk about the minimum wage as if this was an argument, a conflict between the employer and the employee, and the government's going to step in and it's going to use this coercive force and tell the employer, you must pay your workers $15 an hour. And it turns out that the conflict there is really not employer versus employee. It's higher skilled employee versus lower skilled employee. And so when we use this coercive force, the government's saying, all right, you've got to pay your workers $15 an hour. What employers do is they look around and they say, okay, who here's worth $15 an hour? Those people keep their jobs. The other ones don't. And what's the problem? Of course, it's the people who lose their jobs, the lower skilled, the less educated, the less experienced workers. Those are the ones who need our help the most. And they're actually getting the fuzzy end of the sucker in this whole deal. And the reason for that is because we have used this coercive tool. It's very powerful, but it's a very blunt object. And you're more often than not likely to be hurting the very people you're looking to help. And so that's what tends to happen with Social Security.
Yeah. Or minimum wage, you mean?
Or minimum wage, yes.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about minimum wage as we're preparing for this, because I know you've written about that, and just thinking that the ability, it's a significant infringement on individual rights. I mean, the ability to put a price on your own labor. I mean, what could be more personal than that, to say, this is what I'm going to charge you to do something for you. And the government saying, no, you can't do that. You can't work for free voluntarily. Yep. You can't work for $1. You can't work for $10. You can't work for $14. If you're going to sell your labor, you must sell it at no less than $15 an hour.
Yes. And that's, you're using the exact right words, because the way the politicians phrase it is they say, we're going to force the employers to pay $15. Really what the minimum wage does is it says to the worker, if you can't find someone willing to pay you $15, you may not work.
Right. And that's an example, again, where it seems like coercion should only be used in the absence of any other tool, right?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, in general, you don't want to tell people what to do. You want to have maximum freedom, ideally. So a government should only come in and use coercion where absolutely necessary.
Yeah, and that's probably a good practical rule of thumb, is when you see a problem, use cooperation first. only resort to coercion when the cooperation fails. And we tend to do it the other way around. We see a problem, and so many of us immediately run to Washington and we say, we need a law to fix this problem. I know you used to live in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a beautiful example of this. They had a problem with, kids are drinking sugary drinks and, becoming fat because of it. And the city council said, all right, we're going to stop these teenagers from drinking sugary drinks. We're going to use coercion to do it. And we'll impose this large tax on sugary drinks. And what happened? Well, what happened is that Philadelphians went on consuming just as much sugary drinks after the tax as before. What did they do? They drove outside the city limits and bought their sugary drinks there where the tax didn't apply. Oh, and while they were there, they bought their other groceries as well. And so the effect of the tax was not to cause teenagers to become more healthy. The effect of the tax was to shut down grocery stores in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm. Well, they should have just banned the sugary drinks like Bloomberg wanted to do in New York. Of course, I remember his rule. It was nothing more than 16 ounces, but you were permitted to buy more than one. So I'm like, I think I see a hole in this policy, this law, which I think never came into effect to begin with. But
and one of the problems you have with that, and they had this in New York City, is anytime the government steps in with its coercive force like that, it's a siren call to businesses to lobby government for exceptions. And Starbucks did this, and they got an exception for their Frappuccino that had more sugar in it than the sodas did. And yet the sodas were on this banned list and the Frappuccino wasn't. Because why? Starbucks had some in with the mayor.
Yeah. No, I've always said the more rules and regulations you have, the more reason there is for private enterprise to try to, hire lobbyists and so on and convince government to create special rules for them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that's important to keep in mind that entrepreneurs, what they do is they look to make profit. And normally, how does an entrepreneur make profit? By delivering to customers things customers want. Now, when the government imposes itself, all of a sudden it becomes a new entrepreneurial target. The entrepreneur realizes, wait a minute, there's another way to make money now. It's by delivering to politicians what politicians want. And what happens? The entrepreneur's attention turns away from the consumers, from satisfying consumers towards satisfying politicians and bureaucrats.
Mm-hmm. So I would think COVID is the perfect kind of test case for this theory of cooperation or coercion, because we've got 50 different states kind of handling things slightly differently, all deciding whether there's going to be a mask mandate versus voluntary. Is there going to be a vaccination mandate versus voluntary? I know here in California, University of California has just announced that if you want to go to school in the fall, you must be vaccinated. So how do you analyze COVID on the cooperation and coercion scale?
Yeah, COVID is a really hard one because it contains elements of both. One of the problems that we had with how we address COVID is that there was this asymmetry that if on the one hand, politicians didn't do something drastic and people died, everyone would be able to point to that and say, look, these people died because you politicians, you didn't do anything. On the other hand, if the politicians did too much and businesses started to go out of business, yeah, people will see that, but it's a little bit harder to connect that to the politician. You can always say, well, yeah, but this business was going to go out of business anyway. And so the politicians had an incentive to err on the side of doing too much. And so they didn't, New York City's a beautiful example of this. Well, beautiful, if you want to use that word. It is an example of the government going way too far, of shutting down things and making the restrictions so onerous that in New York City, they lost something on the order of 1/3 of small businesses due to to the COVID shutdown. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that COVID shutdown cost us somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 trillion over the course of the next decade. And we didn't spend enough time, I say we, the government didn't spend enough time thinking through carefully the cost on the dollar side of COVID. All they did was they looked at lives lost. And what did they do? They used their coercive force. They said, okay, our goal is to save lives. It doesn't matter how much it costs. Well, if you had left things to the cooperative side of our society, you probably would have gotten a different answer, because every day, each one of us plays a trade-off between safety and some benefit that we're looking to obtain. We're used to doing that. Politicians, not so much.
Yeah, the thing I was likened it to, and I think others have also, is the speed limit on the roads. And, it's set at 55, 65, 70, and clearly people die because of speed. But the government's decided that the utility of having that speed, as far as people moving about, goods moving about, et cetera, outweigh the health risks of it, including
Right.
deaths. So there's some type of measurement was done there to set the speed limit where it's set. If all your focus was saving lives, the speed limit would probably be around 25 miles per hour. But
yeah,
right.
absolutely.
But yet politicians have allowed these deaths to occur in exchange for the utility of the higher speed rate. Whereas with COVID, it seems like there's no balancing whatsoever. It's all about, I think Cuomo was asked at one point, what's the value of a life, as you think about COVID? And he said, a life is priceless. Like, well, that's a nice thing to say as a politician, but the truth is, we put value on life all the time as you make decisions regarding government regulations, and you have to.
Yeah, and each one of us puts a value on our life every day when we decide to walk up and down a flight of stairs or cross a street or eat solid food. Every one of these things represents some risk to us, and we make a calculation. We say, yeah, the risk is worth it, or we say, no, the risk isn't. I want to go back to the speed limit for a minute, because that's a really good example of something that sits kind of in both the range of cooperation and in the range of coercion. And that is, yeah, we have these speed limits, and that's coercion. It's the government saying you will do the following things. But what happens? As long as I've been driving, in several decades of driving, I've noticed that pretty much no one obeys the speed limit. Pretty much no matter where I go, whatever the state is or whatever the decade is we're talking about, people tend to drive about 10 to 15 miles an hour faster than the speed limit, whatever the speed limit is. And what are they doing? That's cooperation. They have decided that this is a safe speed to drive, and we're all going to do this. And the only time we slam on our brakes is when we see the cop sitting behind the sign up there, because we all know we're going to get a ticket. But what happens is we perform this calculation, the trade-off of getting where I need to go versus the risk, and we came up with a different number than what the politicians came up with. And consistently, the number we tend to come up with is about 10 to 15 miles an hour faster than what the politicians say.
So now that you've written this book and you're an expert on this cooperation versus coercion and those concepts, as you look at COVID and how, if you were the governor, what would you have been implementing when it comes to COVID?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the problems here is that, and we kind of knew this more in retrospect, is that COVID really seems not to be one disease, but two. It affects the elderly very, very differently than it affects the young. And what did we do? We imposed a rule, pretty much coast to coast, applying to all people, when we should have been, if we're going to use coercion, we should have been focused on the elderly. Those are the people that were most at risk. And what works in New York City is not necessarily going to work in West Virginia, and that may not work out in Oklahoma. So to the extent that we could, we tended to do this. We pushed the decision making to low levels. Let mayors make decisions for their cities, for their areas, and because they know better what their circumstances are than do perhaps the governors, and certainly more than the president. So in that sense, we tended to deal with COVID a little bit better in that we dealt with it at the low level. But again, what we didn't do was break it out and deal with the elderly different than we dealt with the young. I just came back from a trip. I'm on a plane. And of course, we've got this federal rule. Everybody has to have the mask on anytime you're in the airport when you're on the plane. I'm thinking, this is ridiculous. It's like security theater at the TSA. It's virus theater, right? We all look good because, we've got these masks and so forth. But in fact, what's going to happen? The minute every one of us steps out of the airport, the masks come off. And we're going to be, mixing around with people. And so what you get is this rule that somehow makes it look like politicians are doing something to protect us, when in fact, the rule isn't accomplishing much of anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, it all starts with the concept of, should the government be involved in health to begin with? I mean, raging debate. All of the industrialized countries, as Bernie Sanders likes to say, have, healthcare for all. We're the only one that doesn't. I'm like, well, and we're also the most successful country in general. So maybe there's a correlation there. I'm not sure we should follow everything that the Europeans are doing, but it just begs the question is what is the role of government when it comes to people's health?
Yeah. And I think when we look at when Bernie Sanders does things like they'll point to Sweden or point to Norway or Denmark or whatever it is, one of the things we forget is that those countries are actually the size of US states. And so if Bernie Sanders really wants to do healthcare the way that Europe does healthcare, then what he should be doing is backing the federal government out of it and allowing the individual states to design their own healthcare systems. But even there, it raises the question, what role does a state have in healthcare? And I think that we tend to use the coercion more than is necessary. And I'll give you a good example of this, the FDA. We have the FDA, and people, rightly say, yeah, the FDA protects us against bad drugs, but notice it does so coercively. So if there's a drug out here and it can't go on to market until it gets FDA approval, and if somebody tries to sell it, all kinds of bad things happen to them, that's the coercion. But imagine if we did FDA cooperatively. What would happen is the FDA would do all of the things it currently does. It would test drugs and it would make pronouncements about them. It'd put a sticker on it and say, this drug is FDA approved and this one is not. But if we allowed all the drugs to be sold, whether FDA approved or not, notice something interesting would happen. People who really value FDA approval, they could still go and only buy FDA approved drugs. Other people who have perhaps diseases of which they're going to die and of which there's no cure and there's an experimental drug that's come out in the market, they may be more apt to select a non-FDA approved drug because they don't have much hope to do anything else. That option of working cooperatively and saying, yeah, I'm going to do this even though there's high risk to it, we don't give people that option in this country because we tend to do healthcare in a coercive fashion rather than a cooperative fashion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as long as there's free information out there for people to make their own decisions, then I think that's a brilliant idea to simply make the information available and let people make their own decision regarding their own health, which again, nothing screams out personal freedom and liberty than my own health and deciding how I'm going to take care of myself and what I'm going to put into my body.
Yeah, and I think there you stumble upon a vision of government that I think both the left and the right could probably agree with. And that is, let the government collect this information and disseminate it and say, we say this thing is good or we say this thing is not good, but leave it up to you to make the decision as to what it is you want to do. And people who are more comfortable with government edicts can do what the government says. Those who are less comfortable cannot, is provided that nobody's imposing harm on anyone else.
Yeah. So going back to COVID, you could say the same thing there. Government provide all the information about COVID and let everybody make their own decision as to what level of risk they want to take.
Yeah, that looks about right. Now there's an important footnote with COVID, and that is COVID, of course, is a disease that's communicable. And any communicable disease starts to look like pollution. And we've already said, one appropriate role for government is to prevent pollution, to stop you from dumping trash in my yard or to stop me from, emitting stuff into the environment, because that's imposing harm on someone. If I walk around in public and I'm infectious, I'm imposing harm on others in the same way. I'm emitting this pollution. And so it at least raises the question, it's possible that there is a role for government here on the coercive side. However, I would suppose that role is much more limited than the role it actually took in dealing with COVID.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to how much you value individual liberty versus kind of the collective, and that's kind of the left versus right divide. And if you put maximum value on individual freedom, you'll say that, okay, yeah, maybe we'll put restrictions in place that deal with the elderly as opposed to everyone. Or we'll put restrictions in place that apply to people who actually have COVID as opposed to just blanket everyone.
Right.
But how are we going to bring the left and the right together on things like this when you have such disagreement, I think, on that basic concepts of individual liberty, where it seems like the left puts more value on the collective and protecting everyone equally, whereas the right says, no, it should all be about the individual.
Yeah, and that's the $1 million question. How do you bring these two groups together? I don't know that we could bring them together on a topic like COVID, but I think there are many topics that we could bring them together on. The FDA example I gave you is one of them. And to the extent that we can find topics like that, where there is a way that we can appeal to both sides at the same time, I think something important happens. And that is the two sides start to trust each other. And you don't immediately get this knee-jerk reaction of, well, you're on the opposite side, so you're an idiot, or you just hate the poor, or whatever it is. And that's been going on for so long that we've stopped talking to each other. And I think the right has a lot of really good answers to problems. I think there are other problems in which the left has some decent answers, but we don't get the hybrid of the two answers because we never come together and talk civilly to each other.
Yeah, well, and one of the high level ways of describing that, and I think you talk about this in the book, is positive rights versus negative rights, right?
Yeah.
And I think that there's a divide between the two sides on whether government should be issuing positive versus negative. But explain that concept, and then let's get into that a little.
Yeah, so the idea is kind of simple. A negative right is the right not to be interfered with. So my freedom of speech is a negative right, that I have the right that you don't interfere with my speech. A positive right is the right to have something done for you. So healthcare, if you want to talk about healthcare as a positive right, that means that the government has to step in and provide healthcare for me in some fashion. So positive rights and negative rights. And one of the problems here, we talk about the miscommunication between the left and the right, is that we both use that term, right, but we mean very different things. When people on the political right use the term right, what they tend to mean are negative rights. People on the left tend to mean positive rights, and yet they're using this same word but meaning very different things. And the two types of rights the difference is really important. With negative rights, you can have the exact same negative rights that I have, and we can both enjoy them fully. Why? Because all that has to happen is that nobody interferes with us. With positive rights, we can't both have those same rights fully. If we both have a right to health care, well, there's only so much health care. And if you take some of it, that's less of it that I can have. And if I have more of it, that's less of it that you could have. And so we cannot both exercise positive rights together in the same way, like we can with negative rights.
And ultimately, then, how do you analyze whether government should be in the business of positive rights, guaranteeing things for people?
Yeah, almost never should the government be in dealing with positive rights. In fact, if you go back to the founding in this country, in the founding documents, when the founders talk about rights, they always mean negative rights. The only positive right I think that is ever mentioned is the right to a trial by jury. Other than that, everything is all about the negative rights. And part of the reason for this is because the founders had an image of a limited government. With negative rights, there's nothing there to cause government to grow. Why? Because to protect your negative rights, all we have to do is not interfere with you. It calls for the government to step back and not do things. Positive rights call for the government to actively do things. And so you talk about a right to healthcare and a right to education, and a right to a retirement. Every one of those things requires that the government grow larger and larger because it needs to provide these things.
But didn't that create the situation of the robber barons of around 1900, and government needed to step in because they were taking advantage of child labor and low wages and long hours and so on, and the government needed to come in and protect the people?
That's a really interesting thing, and the acronym escapes me, but there was the law that was passed about that time, and people point to it and say, yeah, it's the federal government who put an end to the 40-hour work week, and put an end to child labor, all of this sorts of things. If you look at the data, which I've done, I picked this stuff out, and this is government data, right? If you look at the data, what you find is that the incidence of child labor in the US was falling precipitously. In fact, it fell to pretty much from whatever it was, 60% down to like 3% before the federal government's law ever came about. So too with the 40-hour work week. We were at whatever it was, 50 hours plus, and that fell to 40 hours, actually fell below 40 hours, and then the federal government passed this law. So in both of those instances, it was very much a matter of, through cooperation, we were already moving in that direction. The parade had already started and gotten far down the road, and the politicians jumped in front of it and said, look at what we did. Well, in fact, you didn't do anything. It was cooperation that did that.
So is there, a lot of rules and came into effect around that time. And I guess you're saying most of these rules are not necessary.
Yeah, what tends to be the case, it's not always the case, but what tends to be the case is that the political climate lags what's going on in society. So society comes to some decision, we want this, and then we get laws. And you could see that playing out right now with marijuana. For decades now, Americans have come to the conclusion that marijuana is not this horrible drug that the federal government has said it is, and that it should be okay to smoke marijuana. And so cooperatively, Americans have already, for decades, we have been accepting of marijuana. It's only lately that governments have turned around and started changing the law. They lag society. They tend not to lead society.
Mm-hmm. And what about things like, monopolies and anti-competitive behavior and unions?
Yeah. So the question with a monopoly is that I always go to is, why is it a monopoly? And there are two possible reasons why a firm is a monopoly. And I'm going to use the term loosely, right? So think just large firm. One possibility is that the firm has instituted some sort of barriers that prevent competition. That's a problem. Another sort of monopoly is the one that delivers a product that is so good at prices that are so low that customers don't want to buy anywhere else. It's the customers that have made it a monopoly. So in the first case, it's coercion. The monopoly is using force to keep out competitors. In the second case, it's cooperation. That customer said, yeah, this is the firm I want. And if you want a beautiful string of examples of this, start with Sears. Sears Roebuck, back in the day, had this catalog. It mailed to every household. You could look through it and had every product that Sears sold, and you could call up and order the thing and it would come to your door. You could go pick it up, this sort of thing. Sears was delivering what people wanted, and it grew to be massive until an upstart came along. And this upstart said, we can deliver to you all of these things and we could do it at a lower price. And that was Walmart. And as Walmart came along, customers said, yeah, I like that better. And they took away this grant of monopoly type status, took it away from Sears, gave it to Walmart. And then another upstart comes along. The upstart says, I can give you the same low prices as Walmart, and I'll deliver the products overnight to your door. And that's Amazon. And what happened? People took away this grant of large monopoly type status from Walmart and they gave it to Amazon. So these firms are becoming large, what we would think of as monopolies. They're becoming large because customers are saying, that's the one I want. That type of monopoly, not a problem. The first one that uses force to keep out competition, that is a problem. But what's interesting about that first type? More often than not, to use force to keep out competition, that type of monopoly has to co-opt the government. And so again, we have some government action coming into the marketplace that's enabling this firm to keep out its competitors.
Mm-hmm. So as you sit here today, when we look at Amazon, the current example, you see no concerns there, no problems.
No. And I tell you why. Because the minute Amazon starts jacking up its prices or maybe skimping on the quality or not delivering on the time schedule that it promises, an entrepreneur will come along and say, I can do it better. And customers will say, yes, you can. We're not buying from Amazon anymore. We're buying from you. It's what happened with Walmart. It's what happened with Sears. It'll happen eventually to Amazon. And whatever comes next is going to be better than Amazon is.
And how do you analyze somebody like Facebook when it comes to monopolies?
Yeah. And Facebook is suffering the same sort of thing. We look at Facebook and we say, well, it's this big, social network, and we call it a monopoly. Actually, Facebook's market share has been declining for the past several years. It's declining precisely because Facebook is doing what I described. It's starting to not deliver the quality that people want. Now, a leading competitor hasn't come to the fore yet, but one will. In the meantime, Facebook's market share starts to fall and fall as customers say, yeah, I don't like this anymore. I'm going somewhere else. And that's the beauty of cooperation. When you don't like what's going on, you can walk away.
And let's just tick off the next one, Google/YouTube. They concern you at all as far as a monopoly?
Nope, same thing. So long as none of them are co-opting the government to protect their space, there's no problem there. Because so long as there's no government involved, you can walk away.
So let's dip our toe then into the censorship that's going on all three of them. Amazon is banning certain books, YouTube banning videos, Facebook banning posts. There's certainly an argument that they're doing that to curry favor with the government, because it seems that what they tend to censor is stuff from the right, and it's the left that seems to be asking for censorship. The right doesn't seem to ask for censorship. So it seems like they are trying to curry favor with the group that's asking for it. How do you analyze that?
Yeah, and this looks bad, and people use the term censorship, and people will say, well, this is a First Amendment violation. I want to underline that it is not a First Amendment violation. First Amendment violation is the government steps in and squelches your speech. Facebook is not the government, and it's Facebook's platform. If it wants to throttle viewers on my page, well, it's free to do so. I don't like it, but it's free to do so. It's Facebook's platform. So to Amazon. And what happens, the more these things happen, the more people will tend to look for alternatives, and alternatives will emerge. The problem is if, as you suggest, they turn to government. And we hear a little bit of that now. Elizabeth Warren, when she was running for president, said in a kind of an offhand way, but it was concerning to me, she said, what we really need is to license journalists. Now, that's a huge problem, because now you have the government coming in and using its force to say who may and may not speak on various topics. The problem there is I can't walk away.
You certainly have the government complaining, again, the left, politicians, including the Biden administration, complaining about misinformation that's out there, and that social media is not doing enough to curtail information specifically about the vaccines. Even though I know, based on personal experience, we've had an episode taken down from YouTube because I had a University of Wisconsin professor on who said that you should be very cautious about taking the vaccine if you've already had COVID, that there's been a lot of significant side effects for people who get the vaccine who've already had COVID, and that it was never tested. The vaccines were never tested on people who had already had COVID. So he put out this significant warning for those people. He's an MD. He's advised congressional committees. YouTube took it down as misinformation. So, and they're doing so in response to the government, the Biden administration, saying that you guys need to do more to curtail misinformation. Otherwise, we may do something to you.
Right. And notice the unstated assumption here. And that is that the Biden administration is able to correctly identify what is and is not misinformation. And that's the ultimate problem here, that we've got the government claiming to be the arbiter of the truth. And I understand that it's not entirely clear, there are things that are unknown about the virus, there are things that are unknown about the vaccines, but the cure to misinformation is more information, not less. let the ideas come out in the marketplace and let them argue, and the ones that are correct, those arguments will rise to the fore, the other ones will fall. This is what we use. People like to say, let's follow the science. This is exactly how science works. Somebody proposes a hypothesis and puts it up for scrutiny, and somebody proposes an alternative hypothesis and puts it up for scrutiny, and you have an argument as to what's going on, and the truth will eventually bubble to the top. You don't have that dynamic bubbling to the top of the truth if, before we've ever figured out what the truth is, we say, well, this stuff over here must be wrong, so let's not talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we certainly have them reacting to a threat or an implied threat of more regulation if you guys don't start censoring what we consider, the Biden administration, to be misinformation.
Right. And the thing we need to keep in mind here, because we tend to ascribe magical powers to government, who is it that's deciding this is the truth? There's some politicians, there's bureaucrats. Yes, they rely on experts, but it's the politicians and the bureaucrats who ultimately make the call. They aren't content experts. The best they can do is what we would do, which is listen to what other people have to say and come to some conclusion. What they're trying to do is substitute their judgment, substitute our judgment for theirs.
Just to stay on social media for a second, Section 230, which gives them, the government, correct me if I'm wrong, is protecting these companies against someone suing them for defamation, libel, etc., because the social media entities are saying that, hey, we're just a portal. We're just allowing people to voice their opinion. This is not our opinion. We make that very clear. And that's why you can't sue us under Section 230 for that. But if they're going to start editing content, then isn't that a situation where, well, wait a minute, you're not just letting this be a forum, you're picking and choosing now what's on your platform. And 230 should either no longer apply, I don't know the details of 230, or we should just eliminate 230.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And again, I also don't know the details of 230, but it does seem right somehow that that a platform like Facebook should make a call and say either we're a communications platform like a telephone company, and whatever goes on is we have nothing to say about it, and so therefore we shouldn't be liable, provided that what's going on is legal, or it's in effect an editorial, a curator of the information, in which case Facebook is actively deciding what you will and will not hear. In that instance, it does seem reasonable that if that's what it's going to do, it should be liable. But what I think is incorrect is that Facebook, try to get the best of both worlds. And that is to say, well, we have the right to curate, but we shouldn't be held liable either. That seems to be a problem.
Right. All right. Before I let you go, I want to hit on three really big controversial issues that I struggle with. I kind of go back and forth as far as my feelings about the proper role of government on these. So since you just wrote cooperation, and coercion, let's tick through these. So abortion, how would you analyze abortion and when it comes to proper role of government cooperation and coercion?
Yeah, so this is a really hard topic that I try not to talk about for obvious reasons. But I'll give this little bit of commentary, and that's this. It seems to me that our discussion on both sides of abortion in this country tend to miss the point and the focal point of the thing. And the focal point of the thing, I think, is this entity, and use whatever word you want, fetus, child, what have you, but we all know what we're talking about here. Is this entity, this thing, a rights-bearing individual? If it is, then it has its right to life supersedes other rights that other people involved may have. If, however, this thing is not a rights-bearing individual, then clearly it has no right to anything. And so everybody else's rights who are involved take precedence. And what we know is that prior to conception, there's no rights-bearing individual here. The other thing we know is at the instant of birth, there is a rights-bearing individual. Somewhere between those 2 points, there was a change. We didn't have a rights-bearing individual. All of a sudden, we did have a rights-bearing individual. I don't know where that change occurs, but that's where we should be focusing. Instead, we talk about, and it is important to talk about women's rights, their bodies. It is important to talk about the right to life, but neither one of those things, I think, get us anywhere toward an answer. What gets us toward an answer is addressing that question. At what point does this thing become a rights-bearing individual? I have no way of answering that, and I don't know of anybody who does have a way of answering that, but that is the key to answering the abortion question.
Well, in the current state of affairs in America is that it seems to be a limited rights-bearing individual during that period that you described.
Yeah, and that's kind of weird. I don't know how to deal with that, because there's no, in our constitutional framework, there's no such thing as a quasi rights-bearing individual. You either are or you aren't, right?
Right. But yeah, that's kind of the situation we're in, with where it's health of the mother versus the baby, et cetera, as far as, I don't know, second trimester or whatever. Okay, I'll hit the next one. Guns. Now, right there in the Constitution, it's obviously says that you've got a right to bear arms, but that doesn't necessarily make it good policy. It's something that the founders liked at the time, but certainly guns, in an ideal world, if we could snap our fingers and have there be zero guns in the world, I think that'd make the world perhaps a better place, or in America or in any particular city. But putting aside the fact that, yeah, I get it, it's in the Constitution, they're allowed. But as you think about the proper role of government, cooperation, coercion, how would you analyze guns?
Well, yeah, we devote a chapter to this topic in our book. And what we do is we ask some pragmatic questions about what is the relationship between gun ownership and homicides. And we look at data across the 50 states and across time. We look at multiple countries as well. And we compare levels of gun ownership to homicides. And we don't find any relationship here. We do not find that more guns are associated with more homicides, nor do we find that more guns are associated with fewer homicides. There seems to be no relationship here. And so we look at various things like this, and we find no relationship in the data anywhere until we look at the relationship between gun ownership and suicide. And there we do find a marked relationship. In periods of time and in states in which there has been more gun ownership, the suicide rates have also been higher. In periods in which there's less gun ownership, the suicide rates have been much lower. And so this kind of makes sense if you think about it, because a gun is a way to commit suicide, is to turn your decision to commit suicide into a reality almost instantaneously. And so there is an argument here, if you want to talk about dealing with mental health, of this relationship between guns and mental health. But in terms of homicides, we simply don't see it. And people will point to things like Australia and say, well, when Australia banned guns, its firearm homicide rate fell. Of course, its firearm homicide rate fell. You banned the guns, but that's not what's important. It's not the firearm homicide rate, it's the homicide rate. And if you look, what you see is at the same time in Australia as their firearm homicide rate fell, their knife homicide rate went up. So all you did was cause people to shift from one to the other. And in fact, over this same period where Australia banned its guns, its overall homicide rate fell by less than the overall homicide rate in the United States. They didn't ban guns.
Interesting stuff. Okay, last one is the death penalty.
Yeah.
Do you devote a chapter of the book to the death penalty?
No, we don't talk about the death penalty. And this is one of these things that my thoughts on it are not entirely clear. I would think, I do see an inconsistency, and I simply point to the inconsistency. And that is, I find a lot of people, and this applies to both sides, I find a lot of people on the one side who are very pro-life, anti-abortion. Not all of them, but a decent number of them also being pro-death penalty. And that strikes me as odd, because if you want to emphasize that this child has a right to life, why doesn't this other person have a right to life also? Do you give it, you're claiming he's given up in some sense. But then I can point to the same inconsistency on the other side. I see a lot of people who are pro-abortion saying, no, this not a child doesn't have a right to life. On the other hand, saying, well, this criminal, we have no right to take his life. Who are we to take the life of another person? And so I have no good answer to your question other than this kind of armchair observation that there seem to be a lot of people on both sides of this question who seem to be thinking inconsistently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you would think that limited government folks on the right would kind of be against the death penalty generally, because we like less coercion from the government, less involvement in things, and but it's also an enforcement issue. And if there's one thing that people on the right agree with, is that at least one role for government nobody seems to dispute is protecting the people. Right.
I preventing harm. Right.
Preventing harm. I mean, basically, we formed the government to begin with to protect ourselves against foreign adversaries, and to prevent or guard against crime in the U.S. Right.
Yeah. And this is right. It raises the question: are there other ways to prevent harm than sentencing someone to death? And I don't know enough about the topic to say one way or the other. Other than to say, yeah, this is a messy. It becomes very messy anytime you're dealing with an instance, and you see this with capital punishment. You see it with abortion as well. It's messy anytime we're dealing with the question of taking away someone's rights, or potentially taking away someone's rights, and the ultimate right, which is the right to be alive.
How about this last one before I let you go? And that is, we're hearing so much about equity these days. It's no more about equality; it's about equity. And I was thinking about it, and government should protect equality, as far as everybody having the right to be treated equally. But equity seems to be all about, coercing or enforcing some end result equality. And that seems to be the difference between equity and equality. One is protecting everybody to be themselves. The other is coercing a particular result.
Yeah, and it's kind of weird, isn't it? Because the people who tend to be most pro-equity of everybody should all be the same are also the people who tend to say that diversity is important. Well, hang on a second, because the reason we have inequity at all is because of diversity. Some of us are smarter than others. Some of us are more attractive than others. Some of us are more talented than others. Some of us are born to better circumstances than others. Because we're diverse in these very important ways, if you leave us alone, some of us are going to rise higher than others. And so to say the government has a role in taking away from people who have risen higher for whatever reason and giving it to these other people, on the one hand, is to say not only is diversity not important, actually we need to level it all out so we don't see any diversity except the diversity of skin color, which is what people sometimes mean when they talk about diversity. On the other hand, there's an important thing that's going to come out, and that is, if you do this, if you say to people who have achieved more, we're going to take away from you and give to people who have achieved less, you have taken away the one of the important motivators. What is the reason that kids spend 4 years in college trying to learn certain things? Why is it that you go to work every day and slogging through this job you don't like so you can move up and get a better job at some other place? Why are we doing this? So that we can move up. If all of a sudden I'm faced with a situation of no matter how high I attempt to move, whatever I get is going to be taken away and given to somebody else, I don't see the point in trying anymore. I might as well just sit back and watch television, because I'm just as well off doing that as I am doing anything else.
Or if it's going to be given to you regardless.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And on the other side, that. Yeah.
It's no focus on the individual. It's all lumping people together. Well, thank you, Professor. That was awesome. What's going to go on at your university as far as vaccines and masks and so on? Have they decided all that?
Well, presumably it's business as normal. So no masks, and the classes are all in person. And I think universities coast to coast are interested in going back to business as normal because they are deathly afraid that students will develop a liking for logging into class remotely. And there goes all of their room and board dollars.
Yeah. Well, UC wasn't concerned about that by requiring vaccination to come to school. Is your school going to require the same?
I don't know that they're requiring it, but they're putting a lot of pressure on students to get vaccinated.
Yeah. I mean, considering the thing, talk about FDA approval, still doesn't have official FDA approval, that is still experimental. It's really pretty shocking that a government would require someone to take this thing that is technically still experimental.
Yeah, what worries me is that the people who have gained some power from these COVID restrictions are going to like it so much that they're not going to go away. And you start to hear this now with the Delta variant and other people saying, well, the flu season was much better simply because of masks, and we should require people to wear masks all the time. And it just bothers me that some people may have developed a taste for power, and they're not going to be apt to be giving it up too easily.
I think we've already seen that. We'll see what happens to Newsom here in California in a couple months.
Yeah, exactly.
We may have to take the power away from him.
Thank you again to Antony Davies. You can check out all of his work online. Just Google Antony Davies and go to Amazon and get his book, Cooperation and Coercion. Thank you to our producer, Michael Parker. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back soon with another episode of The Hidden Truth Show.
Thank you for listening to The Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow. You can find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Join us again next week for another episode of Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow.